expectations. And with the future as it lays ahead of us, I think this document, if it goes out, could open just these unreal expectations. And I was wondering whether it would be prudent for this document to go ahead and to amend it, because, as Joanna said, it is a live document, but maybe to add in the preamble a paragraph explaining the present situation, that it is a live document, that it will be evaluated and adjusted to the need, to the fact of what the future brings. So we make this quite clear with the preamble, and I think that would be prudent to ensure, that this document.
Rosita, you've gone.
Well, yeah, I know. So all I'm saying is,
yeah, no, I've got the gist of what you're saying entirely. Yeah. I think you made a very good point at the beginning that there will be, how shall I put it, temptation, pressure to set aside some of these environmental issues and actions and addressing climate change in the pursuit of getting back short-term growth. Resist that. We've got to do both. We've got to try and get the economy back up, but not at the expense of the issues that are mentioned in this report and the next one. And I think that's going to be an enormous challenge for the council and beyond us as well.
Yes.
So I haven't got anyone else wants to speak. Okay, I'll just check. Is there anyone else wants?
Yes, I just want to come back. I think we need that in writing, but I would like to ask officers whether it is possible to have a preamble to this report to state the fact that it is a live document, that, we are not raising expectation and there will be changes in the light of, whatever. So it's just more clearer.
Well, Rosita, it's our job, if we want to do that, to put that forward in our comments, and the notes will be being made, and if there's a consensus, to ask the Cabinet to include an additional part to the introduction to reflect.
Well, I would like to put that forward.
Okay, well, I'd like to proceed, but
I would agree with.
We can. Has anybody got an objection to? Who is that, please?
Simon, it's David Bill here. It's just a thought. I agree with everything that everybody has said, but one of the problems we have, I don't want to sort of stray too far into district matters, but one of the problems that we face, and it's already been mentioned, I think, by members this morning, and that is the 5-year land supply issue, non-determination, and all the rest of it. All these measures which we have to face in planning are now becoming increasingly impossible to achieve. We've all had a message from the government's chief planner to say that planning it should be business as usual, but of course it's not business as usual, because nobody really knows what's going on to any degree. Is there a case to be made for asking for the planning process, to ask the government for the planning process to be put on pause or to be revised in the light of what the situation that we now face?
Zafar, can you comment on that, please?
I'm not sure I can, because, as I said, if that's the statement from the government's chief planning officer, then it would actually require a response, either collectively through the chief planning officers group, which I can take back to Nigel Thomas to action, or alternatively it'll be down to each planning authority to respond to say, that's not feasible or practical given the current situation.
So what you're saying is it's sort of outside the remit of. Yes,
it's certainly. But what I can do is take that very specific point back to Nigel and and ask him to pick it up. Sorry, Nick Thomas. Ask Nick Thomas to pick it up through the collective work of the planning officers group, which he chairs.
Okay, I mean, I think there's been an issue we'll have to come back to in terms of what's possible and what the government might be kind of hoping or demanding that we do, but perhaps that's best taken forward in other situations. Right. So nobody said they're not happy to suggest that this report needs to have or the document needs to have an additional paragraph added to it, which just notes the current situation and the fluid. And I think that does reflect anyway what Zephyr said in his introductions about this all being fluid and subject to change. So if everyone's happy with that, I propose now to thank Zephyr. You can stay if you want, but I imagine you have other duties you need to attend to.
Yes, I'm afraid so, yeah.
Please feel free to leave the meeting.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to move on to item 9, which is the revised environment strategy and action plan. I'm going to start by calling Joe Gill, Assistant Director of Environment and Transport, to present this item, please.
Thank you, Chair. Before I do, just picking up on actually the last item and recognising the requirements of this committee around referencing, in light of the current virus and in these exceptional circumstances, we need to be mindful going forward of our ambition and both our ability. Just to be clear, I'm happy to take away the fact that the live action plan that's being referred to in the earlier conversation sits within this now item I'm about to cover. So the Environment Strategies Action Plan is a live document, and we could certainly put something fronting to that document that says these are our ambitions and we don't forego them, but in light of the exceptional circumstances we will put something in at that point. So I just thought I'd make that really clear. So we will take that away as officers if that's the requirement, and then I'll move on now to the item that you have the papers for, which start from page 43, I think, in your pack. So through you, Chair, officers are seeking views from the committee on the revised environment strategy, the supporting action plan and part 1 of a carbon reduction roadmap, which has also been considered by the Environment and Transport Overview and Scrutiny Committee on the 5th of March, before then going on to Cabinet later this month and onwards to full council thereafter. The report sets out the existing and the previous policy positions, including the County Council's declared climate emergency in May of last year, which in turn necessitates revising the ambitions in the environment strategy in order to achieve, firstly, carbon neutrality from our own emissions by 2030, and then secondly, support achieving carbon neutrality for wider Leicestershire by 2050 or before. In the background of the report, it explains the requirement for officers to produce this carbon reduction roadmap, which we've broken down into 2 tranches. So tranche 1, which is the one we're seeking views on today, is about tackling the County Council's internally measured emissions, whilst tranche 2 will focus on the Council's currently unmeasured emissions and establishing an approach to reducing wider Leicestershire's. And we've certainly strayed into some of those conversations, and we might come back to them today. It's also worth mentioning that we've obviously linked back to Zafir's earlier presentation and acknowledged the Council strategic plan having been revised to take account of the climate emergency commitments, and those are covered now in our environment strategy on pages 76 to 78 of your pack. Equally, there's more information on the scope of tranche 1 and tranche 2, and that's covered from points 8 right through to point 18 of the report, and it acknowledges that the initial focus will be on tranche 1, which is currently around 13,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent, and we get reports through the E&T committee, their greenhouse gas report annually. I'd highlight, if you have a chance to look while I'm just running through this, figure 2 on page 46, which I think contextualises the scale of the challenge that we face. And then really, I just wanted to briefly cover each of the three appendices. So Appendix A from page 51 is the revised environment strategy itself, which was fully replaced in 2018. So aside from sort of embedding the stronger carbon commitments and changes to the strategic plan, we've taken the opportunity to update the document with legislative changes that have happened, new government policy. We've certainly strengthened some of the objectives and hopefully improved the format of it. Appendix B is the revised action plan, which will look at a rolling 4-year period alongside the MTFS. For all the points that we've mentioned earlier, I think that's a really important strengthening. We've also cleansed any completed actions, so things like carrying out a review of on greening our fleet. They've been actioned and those work packages are now being taken forward, but what we've now done is include new actions across the 6 themes of the strategy, and I think we've already covered the fact that that plan is a live document which will get reviewed annually. The thing I would say is, whilst we're not talking about Tranche 2 today necessarily, it will allow that live document for us to incorporate the outcomes of our Tranche 2 work, which will be really important going forward. And then lastly, Appendix C is the Tranche 1 draft carbon roadmap itself, which summarises the work undertaken to identify possible work streams for reducing that earlier referenced 13,000 tonnes of carbon to zero by 2030. And the work done to date has identified a number of work streams, either that were already planned, then low-cost, high-return projects, through to the arguably low-return and highly complex ones. And the analysis allows for the expected reductions also that will happen at a national level because of things like decarbonising the national grid. Those work streams are broken down for you on pages 94 and 96, with 94 just showing you the range of projects in terms of by the source of the carbon, whilst page 96 shows you them in terms of their deliverability, if you sort of look at the table from left to right. And I wasn't going to go through those, Chair, but examples include things like premises upgrades, so smart heating, building insulation, and business mileage and fleet reviews and partial electrification of the fleet. But in light of comments made earlier, these will all also be refreshed, their business cases, because the world has somewhat changed in recent weeks. And there are both positives and challenges in that, but we will take those through that live environment of approving those business cases. Lastly, I think just in terms of rounding up, in terms of resources, the plan is aligned to the MTFS annual refresh, as I said, so that will allow officers to bid for funding where those business cases support it. And there's already 16 million earmarked in the current MTFS, though I accept that financially the sort of the world is tilted on its axis, so we will be looking at that, but they are supported at the current time. And finally, in terms of timescales, I think I mentioned it earlier, but in respect of the next batch of work on Tranche 2, point 36 in this report does highlight the fact that we anticipate a need for a delay in progressing the Tranche 2 work into early 2021 due to the coronavirus emergency. And with that, Chair, I'll pause and I'm happy to take any questions or suggestions.
No, thank you very much for that. I think that's a very comprehensive introduction to the report. Right, I'm going to ask Blake Payne, as lead member for this area, if you'd like to make any comments at this stage, Blake.
Thank you very much, Simon. Can you hear me?
I can indeed.
Excellent. I don't really have a great deal to add. I think Joe's covered all the bases, and I think Zafar covered the bases on the first agenda item. We strayed into the minutiae and the mechanics of how we're going to deliver the environment strategy and some of the perhaps benefits that will arise from the strategy and the measures that we are promoting in that strategy. All I can say is what we know is this current crisis, according to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, will be short and sharp. And if I was a betting man, climate change will still exist, and I feel absolutely confident that we should carry on this agenda and work towards our obligations of carbon neutrality by 2030. It's a huge agenda. these things won't get sorted out over 3 months, although admittedly there are benefits in terms of transportation and the carbon emissions that are emitted through transportation and the reduction in transportation currently. But we have to keep driving at this, and this strategy will help us move in that direction. So apart from that, I'll open up the debate.
Okay, thank you for those comments, Blake. Now, I'm just going to call on Alan Pearson, because this issue has already been considered at the Environment and Transport Scrutiny Committee, or seems a long time ago now. In actual fact, it was only a few weeks ago, at the beginning of March. So, as the chairman of that committee, Alan, would you like to sort of make any comments or start the discussion?
No, not really. I think we've discussed it at our scrutiny meeting. I think report says it's all. We just need to, get the agreement and support from the cabinet.
Okay, thanks for that, Alan.
Yeah, truthfully, we've done quite a bit of work on this, and the group, the committee has been very positive and very supportive. And again, like we said, we just need to move forward.
Right. Okay. I've got Terry Richardson next, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Fully support what Blake and Alan have just said. I think it's the way we must go. I just have one little query just from reading the report. In terms of our investment portfolio that we're building up, are we including the carbon footprint of those buildings we're purchasing for investments? Because it was just worried if we're not. In the bottom, I think it's the appendix where we're talking about LED lighting in buildings, etc. we own, are we insisting that in buildings that we bought for that portfolio?
Go.
Chair, and nothing with environment is ever straightforward. What we, depending on the government's definition of what we report for our 13,000 tonnes of carbon, the bit that's in tranche 1, some of our buildings are counted in that, so County Hall, etc. Where we are doing asset investment in wider investments and portfolios of buildings, they will fall into our wider LCC carbon, which we think is around about 45,000 tonnes. But we are doing some work on a number of areas, either because we're doing specific things about, once they're in our ownership, retrofitting them and solar panels, etc., or where we're setting up the nature of the lease to ensure that either their use of that building is or isn't applicable and attributable to the county council. And then there's the other things that we're doing, for example, the sort of Lutterworth development and thinking about ourselves as a developer. So there's a whole host of things going on, but all the assurance I would give is that there is the carbon consideration is now a permanent feature of all of those assessments.
Okay, thanks for that. I've got Terry Eynon next.
Thank you, Chair. And I would like to make clear how much I agree with Councillor Blake Payne's comment. Yes, COVID-19 is distressing and is causing quite an impact on our economy, but we can expect, we hope it to be a short term, and climate change is a much longer, much bigger agenda, and I think we don't want to be distracted from that. I wanted to also comment on the diagrams on pages 45 and 46, because I think they are really helpful at putting everything into context. Our 13,000 tonnes or 45,000 tonnes, if we count up all the things that currently we aren't asked to count, is actually quite small compared with the number of tonnes of CO2 that we could potentially influence. So I'm very pleased to see the carbon reduction roadmap for what we actually control as an authority. But clearly the big gains for us as an authority are in the other, all the things that we could influence, the much bigger tonnage of CO2. So I'm really wondering where we're going with, how far are we with kind of project planning a carbon reduction roadmap that includes our wider partnerships for Tranche 2.
Well, yes, and presumably that is also to influence business and public behaviour.
Absolutely, and though COVID-19 will hopefully have some good side effects, on that, and one of them is the fact that we've all not had to drive to County Hall today. We can't guarantee on all of those solving the climate change emergency.
But it could help to make a contribution, I guess. Joe Gill.
Well, yeah.
I absolutely echo the points that have been made. Tranche 2, which all are just to be absolutely clear is the incredibly complicated and challenging part of this, because as we move from the 13,000 tonnes, which is arguably microscopic in that debate, but yet really challenging for us to address, into that wider Leicestershire cohort of carbon, our spans of control and influence diminish, and we've just got to be really pointed in all the first identifying key stakeholders, finding where we have the greatest opportunities to influence or support other organisations to deliver carbon reductions. And some of that will be in how we collaborate, for example, and this is not assurance that it will happen, but there is an acknowledgement. If I give the example of procuring fleet, as we move away from the fleet that we have to electrification or other means, there are obvious opportunities in terms of collaborative buying power across Leicestershire. Everybody benefits, but you do it in one space. We know that the big areas of carbon across Leicestershire, not all under our influence or control, come arguably in 3/3: transportation, the domestic, and then commercial and industrial. And we have to work out where best to place our efforts to realise the biggest levels of opportunity. But we aren't the only organisation that is increasingly recognising and putting itself under pressure to make a change, and we've got to make sure that we find those opportunities to engage with those other parties. All I would acknowledge is we had originally had an ambition to come back to this committee later this year, because we were wanting to have all of those conversations, and I think that's why the report recognises that everybody is entirely distracted, rightly so, by other needs at the moment, so we can't even start those conversations, which is why the timescales have had to be pushed back.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Blake, you wanted to add something?
Yes, if I may, Simon. I agree. The figure 2 on page 46 is a very good diagram and puts in context the challenge. But this terminology, under local authority influence, I understand this is government terminology that we're required to use. It's hard to put a definition to that phrase, if you like. I've spoken to Joe about this. Maybe Joe could have a go at trying to explain where the terminology comes from, because I think if we were being reasonable about this, there are certain factors that contribute towards greenhouse gases and carbon emissions, such as motorway traffic, etc., that, if you like, are under the government's control as opposed to ours, and we certainly don't have the levers, as that particular phrase would lead you to believe, to be able to influence those kind of transportation movements. So it might be worth asking Joe just to comment on where that phrase comes from and how we are using it in context of our own work in Leicestershire.
Okay, Joe, can you add anything to that?
Yeah, just very briefly, under local authority influence, in very simple terms, that doesn't just obviously mean the county council. It includes the district councils and sort of that whole local government infrastructure, and it is a very broad definition. What we do know behind the scenes is that the analysis that central government has done suggests that there is around 4.5 million tonnes of carbon arising in Leicestershire, and 3.6 million of that falls within this under local authority influence. And it is a blunt assessment, but what the difference in really simplistic terms is, the difference between those is what Blake touched upon. The larger figure includes motorway traffic. Obviously we have the M1 running through as a spine road through the county and has a substantial impact. We also have, on our boundaries, we have a power station and there's an airport, and there are some big national pieces of infrastructure that are not deemed to be under local authority influence, and that nearly 1 million tonnes is where they exclude them but then the 3.6 million because of what we do in terms of our impact and influence and relationships around transportation on the minor roads, domestic and industrial partners through things like the LEP, etc., is where they see us being prolific in having those discussions and debates.
No, okay, I think that's helpful, but it perhaps also underlines that this isn't an exact science and these are best estimates.
Absolutely, and the data is sometimes only produced every 3 years, and that will be an interesting challenge in light of what we've already mentioned today, where that sits in terms of the priorities for our next round of data.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Kevin Felton, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to talk about NO2 as opposed to CO2. I think most people are now aware that the A6 through the Kidworths is amongst the worst air quality in terms of nitrogen dioxide actually in East Midlands. And clearly, in the current situation, it is not at all, because we virtually get no traffic. Harbour District Council have done a lot of the work on it. They've obviously, that's their responsibility. We have a live air quality monitor now actually on the road there, so if I wasn't on this Skype thing, I could be looking now to see what the levels are. And the point I'm saying to make here is, though, that as Chairman of Health, we've also had a paper on air quality, because clearly is a major issue regarding the health of people. And I'd just like to see, I think, the county, although the county aren't directly responsible for measuring air quality, perhaps a little bit more in the paper about how it is that, particularly the public health side, we perhaps can in fact be influencing some of the stuff that's going on, and in particular, the way we design roads, highways, mitigation against air quality problems, which I know the districts are working on, but maybe this is the sort of document we ought to put something in. Thank you.
Joe, can you respond to that?
Absolutely, and apologies in a way because I perhaps didn't stress it enough in the initial overview of the report. I think what I would just give assurance is all of those conversations absolutely are happening. And the reason the paper is happening now is because of the climate emergency declaration, and it necessitated us concentrating on incorporating and strengthening our ambitions around carbon and climate change. However, the environment strategy itself has 6 themes, so the other 5 themes go way beyond just carbon and climate. They include references to biodiversity, air quality, health. They take a much broader remit for the environment. They have all been refreshed as well, and they are all captured in the live action plan. So we still retain those ambitions. It's more that for the purposes of this specific meeting, we wanted to give the opportunity for comment on our ambitions to address the impact of the climate emergency declaration.
Okay, thanks for that. And lastly on my list, I've got Dan Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've talked about the incidence of COVID-19 and what it's taught us, but what I've looked at is the situation now, and I think these numbers are right. We have about 3,500 staff-ish working from home. Now, I don't know how successful that particular aspect is actually carrying on and working, but it does open our eyes to an aspect that, you know, we're looking at how we can reduce carbon footprints, and our own building is a very large building, and if it was that it was efficient and better for the welfare of our staff, maybe it's something that we ought to be considering and looking at as a proper piece of work. How efficient would it be? I guess certain teams of people would need to still be in the building, but it would sort of give us a potential maybe to look at the whole footprint of the building, maybe how we use it and the whole campus estate. It's just an opportunity that's arisen through most unfortunate circumstances, but it is a chance, and I think part of our looking at things should be looking at our estate and looking at that as a main building. Having said that, Chairman, I'm very impressed with our sort of slogan, and I think I'm going to start to use this quite regularly now: thinking globally but acting locally. because I think this is important, because we all get caught up with the global aspect of everything regarding carbon footprint, but we ourselves have reduced carbon footprint in this country since the mid-80s to the current time of roughly 40%, which is unique in the world. And we only have that because we don't have coal mines and coal power stations. But I think the positive is that the clean air as a statement is that we all want clean air, and then we want clean and plentiful water, and we want soil that we cultivate for food. These three essential things people can understand, and it is local, and we can work on that. But also on the environment, I'm concerned that we have 13% of the UK land is covered by woodland, and 66% of which is not managed sustainably. Our national forest covers 200 square miles. United Kingdom has 93,630 square miles. So it gives us some measure of impact that we're only at the very beginning of this. I'm not saying we've come lately to this. It's an enormous enterprise, but I feel that if we've got the map and we know where we're going, and I know that Joe's mentioned we can only tackle so much at a time, I understand that, but we've got to have this awareness, and we've got to really look at what our core things, what we can influence, and what we'll need help to influence. And I think that's critical for us moving forward. But what I'd like to do also is to sort of tease out a little bit more about the air pollution and air quality, which I'm absolutely committed to tackling, because it is a very serious aspect for us all. And I wanted to present a thought process this morning that we considered a ban on heavy good vehicles from travelling on A and B roads and country road lanes in Leicestershire, unless they were powered by electricity or hydrogen, and I'll explain that. But to start, after the date of appropriate legislation, because that would all, it's very technical, it isn't a straightforward thing, 10 years. So what I'm trying to do is create a stimulus that we have to look practically. I've spoke to a mechanical scientist who says you won't have electrical lorries because it will take at least 4-ton battery to go into a lorry. There's a whole range of activity and thoughts and work on all of this. But I think we've got to, as a county, have that leadership. We can't decree all this, but if we start to take an active view, and over a 10-year period is a considerable amount of time, I think that we've got to really try and put some markers down on how we're going to go forward. There's a lot of good stuff being spoken this morning, and some of the things I've commented on, I hope we'll go into that debate, but we then need to quickly look at what is practical, how we can go about it, and take it from there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you for that. Quite a few issues raised there, Dan. Joe, do you want to respond to any of that? I think there are some issues there being raised that will require action at national level, particularly the ideas about limiting access to lorries. But as Dan has recognised, the technology is not there yet, is it? It's there for cars, but not really for HGVs.
Yeah, correct. But I mean, I think they're really important and valid points, and all I would suggest is that I think because of the really rich debate today and the County Council's commitment to the environment, what we are at least committing to is not to continue to sort of, pardon the term, but kick the can down the road and look at these issues and wait for everything. I think of the things that were mentioned, I'd just reiterate that in terms of the staff working from home, and there's been a mixed approach to how successful it's been. Colleagues have done fantastically well from an ICT point of view to get everybody to be able to do it. And the benefit of that is you wouldn't go back to the old ways of working. I would suggest, arguably, that debate is definitely being had. In terms of carbon, what it does mean is that we will be, the board that I chair, which has all the different corporate departments represented on it, that looks at the business cases, we will assure the committee that we will now re-look at the business case for some of the building upgrades and retrofits in light of decisions the authority may take about how agile its workforce is, as in we wouldn't use abortive work to increase and expand our portfolio and spend money on it if we are going to potentially be in a different operating model in the future. So the business cases will allow us to do that. On the biodiversity, really important. It's another theme within the environment strategy, and we have done a lot of work behind the scenes, officers to work with Roderick O'Connell's team around his tree management strategy to make sure it's aligned with the environment strategy and planting of more trees and tackling that element as well incrementally. And just the last point arguably on the air quality and transportation and roads, which is a huge carbon contributor, and we know that. We have done some work with the LEP around its local industrial strategy and its energy infrastructure strategy. So we already have mapped the capabilities across the region for things like large-scale battery storage. We're not there yet technologically, but we do know what the capacity and capabilities are, recognising what our bread and butter logistics and agricultural industries are. So those are opportunities to be enhanced going forward. And the same with technology. I think that whilst it might not be the county council's role to make it happen, technological advancements are happening all the time because the government is going to forcibly move us away from diesel and fossil fuels. So the market will fill the void, and we will start to see battery technology hugely improve.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Yes, Hilary Fryer, you wanted to come in. Are you there, Hilary?
Sorry. Are you there? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay now?
Yes.
There's a number of points that have been raised today that affect, obviously, climate change. This thing we're in at the moment, we're going to change our ways of working, we're going to change our way of living. That's a given. But we mustn't lose fact that we could end up with a lot of people working from home or in isolation, like I am at the moment. No one stepped into my house the last 2.5 weeks because I live alone. We mustn't lose track. You could end up with a number of mental problems, depression. It's very lonely. We are getting an older age group, and we're all living longer, hopefully, once this is over. The other thing is about us all turning to electric or some other form of transportation. I live in a terrace street. There's 50 houses. There's probably 60 cars, so we don't always park outside our own street. None of us have off-street parking, and we only have 4 lampposts. So a lot of the things are out of our control. We will not be able to do that. And I do think that running alongside all of this is, first thing we must do is the welfare of our staff. And it will be very interesting when this is all over, and really it has to be quite tactfully done and also in confidence, how many of them feel they suffered by working at home rather than being in a work community. Because often for some of them, that may be the only social side they have. On the whole, I think these 2 reports we've had so far today are fantastic, and we're positive and we're moving forward. But we mustn't lose the underneath stuff. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that contribution. Yeah, we'll take those points on board, particularly your point about loneliness and home working can actually isolate people. I do think that's important. Right, I'm sure Joe's got a good summary of the comments that members have made and the issues that have been raised, and like the previous report, we will send those on to the Cabinet, but reiterate that, again, because of the current situation, these targets, what is possible, is going to have to be kept under review.
Simon, could I just come in
Yeah.
on this? It's a procedural point, first of all. There's been so many good ideas and good points raised by members this morning that is there any chance of it all being put together in a report of some sort that we could all see before it goes to the Cabinet? I mean, one point that Dan raised, and that is the air quality, the impact on air quality of HGVs. That is so apposite to Leicestershire because of course we've got so many warehouses, and I suspect, because we haven't seen the figures, but I suspect that the use of these huge warehouses will have gone up because people are ordering goods online because they can't shop. Therefore, there's probably been no reduction at all in HGV use. In fact, it's probably gone up. Now, I think I would like to see that Dan's points sort of captured in some form, so that we can do a follow up. And the same applies to our original report on the revised strategic plan. There were a whole range of issues raised by members, which I think would justify having a report rather than just saying to the Cabinet, well, we think there should be a revision. I think we ought to spell out the various aspects that we consider to be worthy of further investigation.
Yeah, well,
just a thought, anyway.
Yeah, the notes and formal minutes of today will be drawn up, and then they will go to the Cabinet. I think it's towards the end of the month. When this report comes up, if members wanted to make further representations at that point, then they can do as individuals to the Cabinet. I think the issue then is after that, are we going to see some further actions and changes that arise from recent events? And I think that's going to be the test and the thing we need to monitor, and then come back to these issues if members feel that not enough's being done. But we've got to keep in mind the overall capacity and resources and pressures on the council at the moment. A lot of staff being moved into other areas on a temporary basis to cope with the current crisis. So I think the way forward is to have these notes drawn up and the minutes, and then if members want to make further representations, they can either do so direct to the Cabinet, or if they think that we need to look at this further, then we can bring it back at a later date to our meeting. Is that okay, David? David Bell?
Yes, that's fine, Simon. Yes, sorry, I'm struggling with my cursor here to get.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine, Simon. What you've said is great. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Right. So I'd like to thank Jo Gill for her input into this, and a very comprehensive report and the way that's been introduced. I'd also like to thank Blake Payne for his input. Both obviously free to leave now the meeting, and I'm now going to move on to the last report of today, which
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. The Youth Justice Plan 2020 to 2023. And we have Sharon Cook, Assistant Director of Children and Family Services. She's going to present the report. And we also have Chris Thomas, Head of Service and Early Help for Safer Communities. And then I will ask Mr. Old, as the lead member, if he wishes to add anything to the report. So can we start with Sharon, please?
We can. Thank you, Chair. Morning. I want to present the report before you that is to seek the views of Scrutiny Commission on the draft Youth Justice Strategic Plan for 2020 to 23. This plan is drawn up in line with our statutory duties under the Crime and Disorder Act 1998. I intend to hand over to Chris Thomas at this point, who's the head of service and has been involved in as oversight of the formulation of the plan, to take you through the plan in some detail, and then we'll be open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Over to you, Chris.
Yes, good morning, Chair. What I'll do is I'll provide an overview of key parts of the plan, and clearly answer any questions at the end. And what I'll do is I won't go through the plan in minute detail. I'll just pick out the highlights, and some of which have been picked out in a report that starts in your papers from page, I think it's 99. So the plan, there's a statutory requirement to introduce a youth justice plan in an area, and the youth justice plan, just by way of background, is that it's a requirement for the Youth Justice Board nationally, but also the plan is overseen by the YOS Management Board, and the YOS Management Board is chaired by a senior member of the local authority and has partners on, senior members of the police, the Office of Police Crime Commissioner, from CCG and National Probation Service, to mention some of the authorities, and they are statutory partners around youth justice. So that's the oversight. Just to go through the plan, it primarily deals with the structure of the youth justice arrangements and governance, and the team, the youth offending service team, is a multi-agency team. It does have staff from the local authority, but also from the police, National Probation Service and health. The plan goes through the resources within the youth justice. Also, there's a section on performance. There's a section on what the priorities are moving forward, and also on what the future risks are. So that's a broad overview of the plan. Additionally, in this plan, some case studies have been threaded into the plan. That was as a direct feedback, I think, from members last year when we presented the plan, about having some examples of some of the work that was done. So the plan has been developed, and you'll see that there's some case studies incorporated into the plan. So moving on to the plan itself, again, I've highlighted the structure. So just move into the plan itself. Okay, so the plan is to regularly refresh reports and the performance information that are provided to the YOS Management Board. That's outlined at in your papers, page 107. And indeed, just looking at the reporting cycle outlined on page 107 of the plan, these are the papers that are put before the board during a year, and that has been refreshed this year. Issues such as child exploitation and some of the health issues around the pathway have changed, and clearly the plan will be to put reports on these in front of the oversight board. Other aspects of the plan, there are at part C, moving down to page 109, there's an outline of the resourcing. Relevant points, I think, for members are that in 2019, the Early Help Services, which is now called the Children and Family Wellbeing Service, of which the youth offending forms part, was reduced by 12% in 2019, and a slightly amended service structure, which is amongst the papers, was introduced in April 2019. What is significant about the youth justice element, though, there's been no reduction in the youth justice staff within the Children and Family Wellbeing Service, and indeed there was an increase of 3 project response workers who basically focus on building relationships with some of the most complex young people. Moving on to the performance section of the report, just picking out again just some of the highlights and key points. At page 111, just to give some context to members, there's a national reporting framework for youth offending services, and they have to report on 3 things nationally. That's the rate of first-time entrance into the criminal justice system, the rate of reoffending of the cohort of young people that youth offending work with, and the rate of custody within their area. Additionally, the local management board also asks for a report on performance on the young people who are in education, employment and training at the end of their period of working with the youth offending. So that they're 3 national requirements and 1 local. Just picking out highlights performance, which is again at page 111. The first time entrant performance is quite significant. That is at 144 young people, and there is I have to highlight just a slight typing error there. If you're following this at page 110 at the bottom, it's per 100,000 young people. I think that's got it's not quite represented right in terms of the figures, so that will need a slight amendment. But the rate of first-time entrance is 144 per 100,000, which is quite significantly lower than the regional and national averages, and a lot of that's to do with the investment in prevention workers within the current youth justice arrangements. The custody figures I'll also just pick out as a point as well, that they're per 100,000 young people again. That's moving down to, just scroll down to the plan if you wish to follow, is at towards the top of page 112 in the papers, and the custody figures are again in Leicestershire very low. It's 0.08 young people per 100,000, and that's significantly lower than the average regionally and nationally. The challenge in terms of performance that's outlined in the Youth Justice Plan is around young people in education, employment and training. Currently, the figure stands at 57% of young people, and again, the performance is talked about in terms of young people, so who are at the end of the last 3 months of their order with the Youth Offending Service, and that they are, a review is done to see whether they're actually in education, employment and training. And at this moment in time, that figure is 57% of the last cohort, which is a challenge. The target is to get 80% of young people into employment, education and training. And there's some, the plan outlines that there's some issues and development needed in that area, which I will come to and answer questions on. There's then the plan talks about the developments, and that's from page 113 of the plan. The significant developments I think I'd draw to members' attention is highlighted around page 113. That's the introduction this year of a clinical psychologist and a forensic psychologist, so 2 separate posts, and that's to support some of the complex young people that are dealt with. That's a joint arrangement with the CCG and the City Youth Offending Service, but those 2 specialists give advice to staff working with young people, and will do some consultation with the young people and the complex group. So that's a fairly new development, and again, that's come into force this year. And we'll wait to see how successful that is. Moving again through developments, developing education support is seen as a priority. I've highlighted the challenge in performance, and examples of things that they're looking to do is around desistance, so focusing on young people's strength and work around that. And there's an example, I think, in the plan whereby one of the things that the team do is one of the approaches that's very popular with young people is to develop the post-16 group with CSC cards, which are it's like a test that enables young people to work on building sites and in a building trade. And I just use that an example, and I think that one of the priorities for the service is to develop those kind of strategies, things that young people will engage with. The most significant risk, so moving towards the end of the plan, future risks for the next 2020-23, the most significant risk is around young people at risk of criminal exploitation. This is a growing area of knowledge. There's a lot of joint work with other agencies, notably the police, the National Probation Service, and this is around the national referral mechanism, where if it's suspected that a young person is being exploited, normally by somebody over 18 in relation to a crime, there's a referral to, through a national mechanism that referral will follow the young person at court. That's not to say the young person won't be sentenced, but clearly the exploitation may provide some mitigation in some circumstances. But work around that group of young people at risk of being exploited is both something with the Youth Offending Service internally is working on, but most significantly working on strategies with partners. So for me, that's the highlights of the plan. I do know that from feedback I've already received that appendix is wrongly highlighted on the structure chart, and I believe that you've been given probably an easier to follow structure chart, and that's appendix 3, the paper's page 125. So at that point I'll pause and happy to take questions, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Chris, for that introduction. Ivan, is there anything you'd like to add at this point?
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Yes, the area of the report that causes me the most concern has to be the risk and the potential for exploitation of children, particularly vulnerable children, given the current state of the country. We haven't got schools functioning in the way that they normally do. Schools are a major partner in terms of providing feedback about young people who maybe are at risk of becoming exploited. So apart from that caveat, in my view, it's a very good report. It's a high quality service, and the establishment of the Family Wellbeing Service, now under Sharon Cook's directorship, I think is a really positive move.
Okay, thank you for that. Chris, is there what's the impact of the suspension of court services in terms of youth justice hearings?
At that point, this is all only recently just come into effect, so we're trying to work through that at the moment with the police. But again, we've only just received details that some of the court functions are being suspended. So I know that in some of the critical cases, there's cases being conducted by video link, and we're just trying to develop working relationships with the police and the courts over that. So it's early days at the moment.
Okay. Right, I've got Jeffrey Kaufman. Hey there, Jeffrey. Your microphone's on, but we can't hear you. So I'll move on and then I'll come back to you. I've got Rosita Page, and then I've got Terry Einen.
Right, hello everybody. More of a statement, but a little bit of a controversial question as well. Now, it's understood that some of the offenders prefer being incarcerated, as the conditions sometimes are better inside for them than outside. Now, I also, it is understood that there are some financial existing pressures on our plans already. So I'm very much anti the idea that government has muted that young offenders, women with children, etc., are supposed to be released from prison. Now, I don't know what the point is, but my question really is, how will it, if this is going to happen on a larger scale, what implication will it have on us as an authority? Because I know yacht is statutory and it has got to work with social care. So, in a nutshell, if young offenders were to be released, who has responsibility to ensure they are homed, fed, looked after and monitored? Whose responsibility is it on to keep them on the straight and narrow, and what impact will it have on our plan and our statutory requirements? I know that's a big one, but have a go. Thanks.
Chris, can you respond to any of that at this point? Or is it too
I'll
early?
start with the response. Yeah, there are plans being developed by the National Probation Service and the Youth Justice to release some of the lower, what they call lower risk, or at the end, people coming towards the end of their sentences early. That, in terms of with some of the young people who haven't got settled accommodation, that is a challenge. Offenders, though, in the region or in the city rather than the county, but that will put some partnership work needed with some of the local housing providers. That said, though, there's very low impact. I think there's only one young person, possibly another one in anticipated, who's likely to be released early. But also, I know that Councillor Page, one of the questions was who would be responsible. Well, in terms of in terms of monitoring, if the person was still on licence, that would fall on the Youth Offending Service, or in the terms of the young people who now reached 18, that would fall on the National Probation Service.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got Terry Einen next.
Thank you, Chair. I've got one comment and a question. The overall comment is clearly this youth justice plan is linked to the funding provided to youth offending services nationally by the Youth Justice Board, and it's very detailed and it's a very important report, and thank you for it. But I'm afraid it does read as if it's being written for an audience that is above my pay grade. I found it extremely difficult to read. There are a huge number of acronyms, some of which seem very similar to one another, and I found it difficult as a layperson to navigate my way around it. And though, yes, it was really nice to see the case studies, I think that does help. I think that perhaps not for this report, but maybe for future reports, it would be nice to have some kind of executive summary that and a glossary for future use. And then the things that most worried me in it, and I'm sure worries Ivan Old and the team very much, is what was said on page 112 regarding the lack of interest in employment, education and training, and clearly where young people are finding that they can get highly paid employment working for the county lines, they may well feel that why on earth would I want to have an ASAM-based award or a CSC card when I can make far more money running drugs? So I'm really that really does concern me. And how can we tackle that in a realistic way?
Chris?
Yes, respond to that. I did take on the councillor's point and provide some glossary of terms just in response to the request. But those points are noted in terms of how we developed the plan. We did listen last year and added in some case studies, and we will take, we will consider, and I agree, maybe not for this plan, but future, in terms of how we present the plan. So that's the first point. The second point, in terms of our young people, one of the things that we do know, because we do a quarterly report to our oversight board, is that we have a good handle, the service has a good handle on where each of the young people is that represents the figures that we give. So normally the cohort of young people is around 25 young people, and of those that are not in education, employment or training, that usually can be then around sort of 8-10 young people. There's a breakdown of where each one of those is and why they're not, why they've fallen out of education, if you like. And the councillor's point is an area that we're having to develop, because we know each individual case. There are a growing number of cases where it is difficult to, as we pointed out, to get the motivation of those young people linked to potentially the pull from older people in county lines. And again, so this is why it is key for us to work with partners in terms of looking at strategies to re-engage young people. But certainly the highlight that I did give in the report, that we've increased the workers by 3 in project response, is a direct response to that problem by feeling that we need to have greater contact with those more complex young people, and that is what our additional resources are looking at doing. But we really do need to work on this with partners, because it's no one agency can provide the solutions, and that includes the education providers.
Okay, thanks for that. Jeffrey Kaufman, are you able to hear us now? Jeffrey? I think your microphone's not working again. Hilary Fryer, please.
Thank you very much. I personally think, on my own view, I would like to thank Chris, Sharon, and the whole team in Children and Young People and Social Care, and of course Ivan himself. This is an excellent report. I think it's quite interesting because we get our figures in percentages. It sounds as though we have a lot of young people that aren't in education or in work, and it's a struggle. But as Chris has just pointed out, or people that are reoffending or are being released into the percentages often aren't the true figure. The true figure is how many, not in the percentages, but how many. Is it 10? I don't know. I don't know what 50% of something is. So that's one point. I think one of the things that will come out of the situation we're in at the moment, from my own experience in where I live, huge numbers are now talking to each other that can offer services that never came forward before. The chances of having work experience, going and working places is increasing. I've just had people in my own road communicating with all of us saying, I'm a school teacher, I'm a French teacher, can I help with the children? Can I help with the young people? Remotely, obviously, keeping distance. But I think you'll be quite surprised how much more comes to community. And I think also, and this goes across the board, I think too long in this country, we have made a big thing that you've got to be qualified, you've got to go to university, you've got to get this. I never went to university. I went to a secondary college. I was there for a year. I went to 14 different schools in my school time, in many different countries and areas of the country. I don't consider myself a failure. And I think we've got to stick around. There are other things to do besides always academic. I think we've got huge talent that we're just not catching into with these young people. And instead of us telling them what they've got to do, we've got to find out what they would like to do. The only other thing I think we will find at the end of this period of lockdown, etc., no schools, no colleges, is, okay, at the moment, we've only been doing it for 2.5 weeks. If we're still doing this in a month, what are our young people going to be doing? And the stress on them. Plus, the people children and people in care who wear, or in foster care or anything like that, where they've normally been going out during the day, it's a complete, almost furnace or hotbed, where they're now all stuck at home. And we have also heard nationally that some of the people that have been able to take care of children or look after children are themselves now not sick. So what happens there? But on the whole, thank you very much, and keep up the good.
Okay, thanks for those comments. Of course, we are talking about the youth offending, those young people involved in the youth offending service, rather than young people in general. Right, Alan Pearson.
Just to support some of the comments is some of these offenders are not education and training. A lot of them had a bad experience at school, as you're aware, education-wise, and also their support mechanisms are different or not as effective. I guess what I'm trying to say is what resources, ongoing resources. I mean, we've got families in Melton that have been in trouble, that females require. I've got children, and they've been and they need family support and children support, and they need additional funds to make it sustainable for them to achieve the results that we want for them and getting them into work. So I just wonder how good are our resources and funds ongoing to support this type of action.
So are you talking about those young people that are involved in the criminal justice system, or just young people in general that need extra help?
No, it's criminal justice as well. They're both very close. I mean, we've got estates here where we've got they live side by side, and there's instances, some tip over the balance where they're struggling to make ends meet. They've got children they can't afford to keep, or if we try and get them into, I think Terry's mentioned it quite clearly that, you know, unless we give them the resource and support and an ability to earn money to be able to fund and pay for the family, they're more likely to go back to crime. And what we're saying is, what are the level of resource to prevent them, reoffending and ongoing? How long does that go for? And what is the package, and how effective is it? These are sort of questions we should be asking ourselves.
Okay, so Chris, what would be a typical intervention from your service in terms of what the type of person Alan's describing?
Yeah, well, split it down into two parts really. We work statutorily with children who've been to court, and now the biggest orders that we deal with are referral orders where young people are then panels put together by some of our volunteers, people in the community, and sort out both what reparation and what young people will need to do in terms of development. So those orders typically are either for 3 or 6 months, and our youth offending workers will then work with the young people on an agreed plan to help them either learn from their crime and also develop as a young person. So they're often 3 to 6 months. We have a small handful of young people on YROs, which are youth referral orders. So they're the orders that really just fall down to young people who are on the cusp of custody. Those orders are a little bit more intrusive and can lead anything up to 25 hours a week contact time with a youth offending worker. We have only a small number of those orders, but again, our project responsive, which was we initially had 2 staff, but our additional 3 staff that I talked about in the plan would work with those most difficult young people. And then finally, where as a service, and this relates to the first time entrance, the context why we perhaps have really quite low numbers compared to other areas, is that we have quite a firm prevention offer. So that is the young people that we don't have to work with because they've not been to core, but we do quite a lot of work because quite often those young people are now becoming more complex. Sometimes they can be siblings, younger siblings of children that are we statutorily work with. So we know that there's almost like a reason to get into those young people early. Now those young people, again, we work with from anything up to give them one-to-one support, depending on what the nature of their issues are, for up to 6 months. And I think my final point with that, of what it looks like, a lot of thinking last year around joining the youth offending service with our family intervention services is that our prevention staff now are embedded with teams, with staff giving our old children's centre programme and our old SLF workers, and we try and look at a whole family approach. What's that mean in reality? In reality, that means that we do quite a lot more parenting. So where the young person's problems is to do with some of their behaviour, but also some of their parenting, that we've built up the strength of being able to work with the family in those circumstances. So if that gives some kind of context to the councillor's question.
Okay, Alan, did you want to come back briefly?
Yeah, sounds great. Look, I like the family issue. To me, the key is early intervention. I think we all agree with that. We get them early. As you're aware, I live very close. Well, you may be aware, but I live very close to a state. And once these offenders, their family, children are brought into this is where we need to focus, because they will pick up the bad habits. They'll be brought up in an atmosphere where there's a lot of issues going on. So if you're saying, Chris, that we have a program of early intervention, and I do believe that's where a lot of energy should be. Prevention is the best cure. It sounds very good, but I'd love to know more about our early intervention programs, particularly with these types of families.
Well, could I suggest you perhaps have a Skype session with the relevant officers and talk about your particular issues in your locality? Is that perhaps the best way forward? You can learn more about it.
Yeah, it's not learning because it's an area I've worked in myself, but I think we all know early intervention works. And what I'm saying is we tended to see to be fight the fire resources, so we spend a lot more money further down the line, when actually the resources, if we bite the bullet a bit and focus on early intervention, we have less problems in the future. That's been researched around the world and proves to work, early intervention. And I'm sure we're doing some of this. I'm just interested to know how much are we doing, and are we recording the effectiveness of it?
Ivan, have you got any comment on the wider issue? Because obviously that would be linked to resources.
Thank you, Simon. The whole programme is geared to prevention. And what we've done is to bring 4 different work streams together to establish the Family Wellbeing Service. Our figures for youth offending might be, and this is speculation on my part, significantly higher if we hadn't had such a successful Supporting Leicestershire Families programme from when it was first set up. Nobody will ever know what impact that has had because it's not always possible to measure outcomes with a degree of precision. But when you read the report in front of you, it is located around prevention. It is located around very clear identification of individual young people and what can be done to help them. And I think members of Scrutiny should be reassured by what Chris has just said, explaining how people are identified and how they are helped and looked after. No system is ever totally perfect, and the great problem for anything is if a young person is unwilling or their family are unwilling to work with our particular workers. That fortunately is a very small minority. The report is really good. The service, the youth offending team, they do first-rate work, and this Family and Wellbeing Service at the moment is showing all the signs of being a very successful development.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm just going to try Jeffrey Kaufman one more time. Jeffrey, are you there? Again, your microphone come on my panel, but I'm sorry, we can't hear you. That is frustrating because you're the only person who hasn't been able to make their contribution on this paper. Right, Rosita, I'm going to give the last word to you because we have been going over the 2 hours now, and then I'm going to thank the officers for the report.
In regards to Jeffrey, maybe he could type into the conversation panel. Anyway, my quick question is, Chris, page 110. Now, we are saying that the board or the service works across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. Now, the breakdown on the resources is there is no reference to the city, and it's just a matter of curiosity. The point local authorities of £298,000 is that all of the local authority, is that only Leicestershire? So I'm really kind of interested what the actual input from all of the authorities is financially, because it isn't quite clear on that. Thank you, and thank you everybody.
Okay, Chris, can you just answer that point in terms of how the system's structured and funded?
Yeah, the youth offending service is just a county service, so the city is completely separate. The statutory partners in youth justice are the local authority, the police, National Probation Service and Health, which is the CCG. So they are the contributors, with the county council being the most major contributor. The district councils aren't asked to contribute. There is, what you'll see from page 110, a contribution from Rutland, because they, if you like, commission that service of the youth offending. So they actually appear in the funding because they make a contribution for the service they get. I hope that explains the structure.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Right.
Nothing from Leicester. What's Leicester's situation? I still don't.
No, the service just covers the county, Rosita. That's how it's structured and operated within the county council. The city have a separate youth offending service.
Ah, okay. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody else.
Right. Right. So I haven't got anyone else indicating. Jeffrey's just sent in a message. So that's flashed off my screen. Something to do with Oadby and Wigston.
Yeah, sorry, just to let you know, Mr. Kaufman has just asked if reference to Oadby and Wixton on the map on page 109 can be added.
Chris, can you just help us a query about the map? Does it need to cover the whole of the boroughs, districts?
Yes, I'm just trying to look. Is it page? I'll just to clarify with you, Joe. Which page is he referring to? Is it page 105?
109.
No,
no, he's come back now and said 105. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yes. Yeah. No, that would need amending. Yeah, I see that it's not been placed on there. Yeah. I see now.
So that's just an error. It should.
It should be. We'll pick that up. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sure Jeffrey will be happy that Oadby will be added. Right. Can I thank you very much for your contributions to Ivan, to Sharon Cook, and obviously to Chris Thomas. That completes our agenda today. I think that this meeting's gone very, very well, both from a technical point of view and the contributions from members and officers in the way we've got through the business. I hope this will serve as a good example for further meetings, depending on how long the situation continues. But maybe even when the current crisis is over, we could look to do more meetings through this way, because it's just hopefully going to be easier for everyone, particularly for informal meetings, but maybe formal as well. So can I thank you all for attending today. The next meeting is due on the 10th of June, subject to no need to have an urgent meeting if anything happens. And please continue to use Skype as a main way of contacting and being involved during this difficult situation. So thank you again for coming today, and I will now close the meeting, and we wish you well and hope you stay safe. Thank you, and thank you for the messages for the way I've chaired the meeting. I hope you agree it's gone